All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a 2,000-year-old literary puzzle that carries some truly massive theological implications. For centuries, one specific passage in the book of Hebrews has served as a cornerstone for how millions of people understand the nature of the divine. But what if we took a closer look at the ancient Greek grammar, the cultural context of the first century, and the specific literary style of the author? What if it reveals a completely different picture? Today, we're opening up the source texts to decode the enigma of Hebrews 1:10.
So here's the absolute crux of the debate. The text quotes an Old Testament psalm saying, "You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth." Now, the traditional assumption has almost always been that God the Father is speaking here, directly addressing his son Jesus as Lord and creator of the physical universe. But we're going to play textual detective today. We're going to examine scholarly arguments suggesting we might have been assuming the wrong addressee this whole time, and see if the evidence actually points to these words being directed back to God the Father instead. To crack this case, we'll hit 6 key areas: the Hebrews 1 enigma, syntax and cultural context, the grammar of conjunctions, Gaston's two-quotation method, the immutable cosmic judge, and finally, a synthesis on interpretation.
Starting with part 1, the Hebrews 1 enigma, and identifying exactly what is at stake here.
The quote from Hebrews 1:10, which originally comes from Psalm 102, reads, "You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands." Trinitarian scholars have long relied on this exact quote to argue for the Son's pre-existence and his role as the literal architect of the physical universe, assuming, of course, that the Father is speaking directly to Jesus. If that's the case, it is a massive theological statement. But the counter-argument asks us to pause and look at exactly what happens right before this sentence.
Which brings us to part 2, syntax and cultural context, serving as our very first clue.
If we back up just one sentence and read verses 9 and 10 together, things get really interesting. Verse 9 ends by talking about the Father, saying, "Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you." Immediately after mentioning the Father, verse 10 kicks off with, "And you, Lord." Scholars who point to an alternative reading argue that, syntactically, the title Lord in verse 10 is referring directly back to the very last mentioned deity at the end of verse 9, and that is God the Father. In this view, it isn't the Father suddenly calling the Son Lord. Instead, the author's just continuing to praise the Father who just did the anointing. This brings up a pretty massive cultural question regarding how families and authority actually operated in the ancient world. It's an absolute must-ask when we're trying to interpret ancient Near Eastern texts. Under the traditional reading, the Father is addressing his Son as Lord. But if we step into the historical and cultural framework of the first century, it is virtually unthinkable that a father would ever call his son Lord. Think about it. Just as King David would never call his son Solomon Lord, the cultural reality strongly suggests that the Father is not the one speaking to the Son in verse 10. The authority structure simply did not flow in that direction back then.
Let's dive into part 3, the grammar of conjunctions, which gives us clue number 2.
Okay, we have to geek out on a missing Greek word for a second, because it's a real game changer. We need to look at how the author of Hebrews strings Old Testament quotes together. In Greek, they use specific conjunctions. Kai, which just means and, is heavily used to introduce a new contrast or to shift the subject. But the phrase kai pollen, meaning and again, is explicitly used to signal the continuation of a thought about the exact same subject. The pattern the author uses is actually brilliant. In Hebrews 1:5 and then again in 2:13, when they string multiple quotes together about the same subject, they use kai pollen, and again. But right here in Hebrews 1:10, the author uses a simple kai, just and. Because verse 10 uses a simple and rather than and again, grammar experts suggest it intentionally introduces a shift. It's returning to the Father's role as the creator, rather than continuing the direct address to the Son from the previous verses. Moving right along to part 4, Gaston's two-quotation method, giving us our third big clue.
Have you ever heard of Gaston's two-quotation method? It is a classic ancient literary device. Think of it kind of like double-clicking a folder on your computer. The author clicks on the first quote, which then opens up a second quote to expand on the core idea. It maintains a neutral, thematic link even if the actual person being spoken to completely changes. So how does this actually play out in our text? Well, first, the author establishes a contrast. Angels are created and temporary, but the Son's throne is forever. Step 2, Psalm 102 is quoted to expand on this exact theme of temporary versus eternal. Step 3, the conclusion is that the temporary creation, like the angels, will perish, but the permanent divine throne of God remains.
So under this method, Psalm 102 isn't randomly thrown in to call Jesus the creator. It's there to reinforce the fragility of the created order against the absolute, unchanging permanence of the divine throne that supports the Son.
Let's move into part 5, the immutable cosmic judge. Clue number 4.
Going a bit further into verses 11 and 12, still quoting Psalm 102, the text says of the heavens and earth, "They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment." The author is quoting this to speak of the Creator who will one day roll up the entire universe. But here's the fascinating key. In a parallel passage later in Hebrews chapter 12, it is explicitly the Father who is identified as this cosmic judge, the one whose voice shakes the heavens and the earth.
So the logical argument here is super tight. Step 1, the Father promises the Son an eternal kingdom. Step 2, Psalm 102 establishes that the Father is immutable, unchanging, and ultimately outlasts the physical universe. Step 3, therefore, the Son's kingdom is eternally secure precisely because it is founded on the unchanging nature of the Father who granted it in the first place. The immutability of God guarantees the throne of the Messiah. And finally, part 6, a question of interpretation, where we synthesize all of this. When you pull all these threads together, an incredibly robust picture emerges from the source material. Syntactically, the word Lord refers back to the Father. Grammatically, that simple "and" signals a shift in the subject. Culturally, fathers just don't address their sons as Lord. Literarily, Gaston's method shows the quote is expanding a theme about permanence. And theologically, it is the unchanging Father who guarantees the Son's throne. By looking objectively at all these elements, a strong, non-ontological framework emerges that completely shifts how we can read this ancient text. It argues the passage is a praise to God the Father, not a re-identification of the Son.
So, what's the big takeaway for us today? It is just wild how stripping away our modern assumptions and looking objectively at the source material reveals such deep layers of historical meaning. Entire, massive theological frameworks have been built on verses exactly like this one. Realizing that the original author may have been using specific grammatical markers to say something entirely different forces us to be incredibly careful and respectful of the ancient text.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. How much theological weight does a single Greek conjunction like "and" carry in shaping our entire understanding of history? It just goes to show for sure that there's always more to learn and old assumptions to challenge when you look really closely at the text. Thanks for exploring this explainer and solving this textual mystery with me.